Tobago as we know it is at risk.
The fabric of our society is at risk. When men gather in a room to come together for a common cause, religion has been accused of being one of the most divisive elements of the human race, or one of the most divisive devices used in the human race to highlight our differences, really. Wars are fought in the name of religion. But yesterday, a thread united all of the men in that room. That thread was a call to the government. They basically stood their ground and said that the LGBTQI community in that agenda is supported only by 10% of our nation, and that those persons, according to what was said yesterday, will create havoc. In fact, I was waiting to hear someone say Sodom and Gomorrah will return, but we stopped short of that. In the end, this is a conversation which I thought our society has moved beyond, not for any other reason. And I stand on no particular position this morning because I've gotten every sort of vitriol thrown towards me in relation to emails that I've gotten as it relates to my position on this. But we cannot, as a society, bury our heads in the sand. There are persons who are suffering. There are persons who are confused. And education and conversations are the way forward to any nation. At one time, the Old Testament said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Then Jesus came, saved us all, and we move forward. We don't abide by these laws. As such is the progress of any nation. In fact, I statistically show that there are some churches globally which have now started the conversation, because in the end, you can no longer ignore this. When I heard the term diseased yesterday, I thought the fair tactics and the fear mongering. HIV and AIDS, which is the only thing I can assume as was being referred to in that conversation, is not a homosexual disease. Statistically, if you look at what's being presented by PAHO and other international agencies, it's a global epidemic that we are fighting to get to zero. But it's not limited, nor is it isolated to the LGBTQI community. So that in itself is a fallacy. This morning, Sharon Motley joins us on set. She has been very vocal. In fact, she's one of the faces of the movement, and what they refer to as the movement, to begin the conversation. There were scenes of joy and jubilation outside the High Court about 2 months ago, less than 2 months ago. Now, with this conversation, and the government making it quite clear that they're not going to touch this. In fact, while we respect human rights, let the Privy Council decide how much rights you really have. And that in itself seems a bit hypocritical, because no government has attempted to start conversations on what first world nations see as simply conversations. Sharon, good morning. How are you?
Hi, good morning. I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
My first question to you this morning, that meeting yesterday. You know, it's interesting to see all of these men in one room at a time when there was a conversation about a hijab and who allows whom on the premises. Were you surprised that religion has now united against your movement?
I was not, and I am not surprised. And as history will show, that any great struggle and struggle for change and struggle for rights, you know, when we look at the civil rights movement, when we look at the rights of women trying to vote, you know, all of those were hard fought struggles. And the opponents really were people who were in positions of leadership, people who were in positions of influence, and is what we choose to do with that influence, you know. And we could use that influence to unite in positive ways, or as we saw yesterday, to unite in ways that causes fear and possible discrimination and harm.
I want to deal with two things. In fact, yesterday, the statements put forward is that the statements are that less than 10% of the population supports this conversation, that it's a vocal group in the media and also members of the media that seem to be supporting the LGBTQI agenda.
And I think it's interesting when we start to talk about numbers, you know, and 10%. Is it that 10% of the people, if that is true, and I will beg to differ strongly, even if it's 10%, does that mean that 10% of our population should not have rights or should not live free from fear of harm and hatred? Is that what we're saying as a society, that there are groups of people that are vulnerable, and because of that vulnerability, we should just leave people out into the wilderness?
The use of the term diseased was also, and I didn't think it was carried in the story that we aired, but opening the doors to diseases. I was a little shocked, and while there was no explanation or expansion on that term, what are they referring to?
So I've been involved in HIV work since, and I would say this is probably year 26. And when we talk about HIV, I talk about HIV education, prevention, and awareness. And what this government and governments across the region and the globe has spent a lot of resources, time and resources, educating people about HIV, stigma and discrimination, and the impact of stigma and discrimination on people who are living with HIV. And what we've seen across the data has shown is that the fastest growing group of people living with HIV in countries like ours are girls between the ages of 15 to 19. And when we look at the spread of HIV and who's vulnerable, it's really the heterosexual population. So we're going back to a time of the 80s when people didn't know better, when there was a lot of fear. So to say in 2018 or to try to infer that HIV is a same-sex disease, that's a little bit, and I don't want to say, but I will say it's a little bit ignorant in 2018. If you go to any of the places that provide services to people with HIV, what you will see is people of all sexes, genders, age, and ethnicities, seeking services. So it's very myopic. And again, what is the intent of a statement like that, right?
What is the intent of yesterday's press conference? Has it now stopped your conversation? Governments have routinely and traditionally and historically been afraid to confront religious bodies because we still hold the view that churches hold the power of the electorate.
And I will say it's important that the LGBT fight or movement is not a new one. Gay people have been around in Trinidad and Tobago since Trinidad and Tobago has been around. We've been in existence since time immemorial. We didn't suddenly just land. We didn't come on a spaceship. And even within Trinidad and Tobago, this conversation began many, many years ago. Even before the HIV epidemic, in the 60s and 70s, within the community, you had people who were pushing the boundaries for not necessarily only for acceptance, but for safety, for an ability to live free from fear and harm. And so what you're seeing now in 2018 is just part of a journey and a conversation and a movement that started long before. And we are at the point now that there is no turning back.
You say that there's no turning back. What do you think is going to be the outcome of yesterday's press conference? Has the conversation stopped?
And I will say to our faith leaders, I am worried, and I'm worried really for your congregation. If at this point in time, as we look around the state of affairs in our nation, evidenced by a woman being beaten to death, when you talk and when you look at the data from the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, the state of our families, our children, if you look at our healthcare systems, the growing numbers of people living with cancer, those are the issues that are of pressing concern to your congregation. Those are the issues that you need to be focused on. And what you're going to do, focus on the LGBT community and us calling for inclusion of sexual orientation in the Equal Opportunities Act, which is not to give us right, but it's really to protect us from discrimination in housing, education, and employment. Is that what you're saying? That is so wrong.
Is it now them versus us?
Not necessarily, because as I tell people, religion and homosexuality are not mutually exclusive.
I'm going to pick you up on that point when we come back from this break, because she's a devout Anglican and says her faith has not been shaken and she still believes in her church. Stay with us. This is The Morning Brew.